Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. A Chance Encounter in the Rain. The rain fell in silvery sheets, drenching the cobblestones of New Haven's narrow streets. Ellie tightened her grip on the worn leather strap of her messenger bag as she darted from awning to awning, seeking refuge from the unrelenting downpour. She loved the rain, usually, a rhythm that felt like nature's symphony. But tonight, it played a cruel melody. Soaking her favorite novel and smudging the ink on the list of things to do before turning 30, she'd scribbled in a rush that morning. Her life felt like one perpetual checklist. Ellie, 27 and already a senior analyst at a prestigious firm, lived by goals and deadlines. But her romantic life? That was a blank space, something she often convinced herself she didn't have time to address. Until tonight. She reached the quaint cafe tucked into the corner of Willow Street, just as the rain turned torrential. Inside, the warmth of golden light spilled over mismatched wooden tables, and the comforting hum of conversations wrapped around her like a favorite scarf. Ellie shook off the rain, her curls clinging stubbornly to her cheeks, and glanced around for an empty seat. That's when she saw him. Seated in the far corner by the window was a man so engrossed in his book that he seemed oblivious to the world, or the puddle forming around his shoes. His hair was dark, messy in the way that suggested carelessness rather than effort. A half-empty cup of tea sat beside him, steam curling upward in ghostly tendrils. There was something inexplicably magnetic about him, as though the rain outside had conspired to frame this moment just for her. Without thinking, she approached his table. "Mind if I sit here?" "It's a bit crowded," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies taking flight in her stomach. He looked up, his hazel eyes catching hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt. "Of course," he replied, his voice warm and textured like the pages of an old book. Ellie sat, and silence stretched between them, not awkward, but expectant. She pulled out her damp notebook and tried to focus, but her eyes kept drifting to the stranger's book. She finally worked up the nerve to ask, "What are you reading?" He held up the cover, a weathered copy of The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. "Ever read it?" She shook her head. "No, but it's been on my list forever." "Then you're missing out," he said with a half smile, one dimple flashing in his cheek. "It's about a secret library and a cursed book, but it's more than that. It's about love and loss and the stories we carry." For the first time in years, Ellie felt compelled to forget her checklist. The stranger's voice wrapped around her like a spell, and before she knew it, they were talking. About books, music, the absurdity of pineapple on pizza, and the poetry of rainy nights. Hours slipped by unnoticed. The cafe emptied, and the rain softened to a gentle drizzle. Ellie found herself laughing at his dry wit and marveling at how easy it felt to talk to him, as though they'd known each other in another life. His name, she learned, was Caleb, and he was a journalist who traveled the world chasing stories. "Isn't it lonely?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Constantly moving?" He shrugged, a shadow passing over his face. "Sometimes, but it's worth it for the stories. Like meeting you tonight, this feels like a story waiting to be written." Ellie flushed, unsure whether to laugh it off or let herself sink into the moment. But before she could decide, Caleb glanced at his watch and stood, his movements reluctant. "I should go," he said, slipping on his coat. "But here." He tore a page from his notebook, scribbled something, and handed it to her. "A little treasure hunt," he said with a wink. "Find me, and we'll write the rest of this story together." And then he was gone, leaving Ellie with the faint scent of rain and his note. She unfolded it, her heart thudding. It wasn't an address or a phone number. It was a cryptic message. Find the place where words are born, beneath the watchful eyes of history. The next morning, she scoured the city, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The public library? A bookstore? The university archives? Hours turned into days, each clue leading her deeper into Caleb's enigmatic trail. Along the way, she rediscovered her city and herself, meeting strangers who seemed to know Caleb and shared pieces of his story. But when she finally solved the puzzle and reached the final destination, a tiny, hidden library nestled in the city's oldest building, Caleb wasn't there. Instead, she found a book waiting for her on the desk, its title etched in gold, Ellie's Rainy Night. Inside was the story of their meeting, written in Caleb's unmistakable voice, with an ending that read, "Sometimes the best love stories aren't about two people finding each other, but about one person finding themselves. Ellie, thank you for being part of my story. Now, go write your own." Ellie closed the book, tears blurring her vision. It wasn't the ending she'd expected, but maybe it was the one she needed. Chapter 2. The Words Between the Lines. Ellie stared at the book in her hands, her heart a tangle of emotions. The weight of Caleb's words pressed against her chest, like the first notes of a melancholic sonata. She ran her fingers over the embossed title, Ellie's Rainy Night. It felt deeply personal, yet maddeningly incomplete. Was this really the end? Or had Caleb left her with yet another puzzle? The library was quiet, its ancient walls breathing stories of centuries past. Ellie wandered between the towering shelves, every step echoing softly on the polished wooden floor. She half expected Caleb to step out from the shadows, his lopsided grin ready to tease her for taking so long to find the place. But the only sounds were the faint rustle of pages and the occasional creak of the building settling into itself. Determined not to leave empty-handed, she flipped to the book's final page again. There, scrawled in Caleb's unmistakable handwriting, was a single line she hadn't noticed before. "Look beyond the ending to find the beginning." A thrill shot through her. Caleb wasn't done with her after all. The next morning, Ellie took the book to her favorite cafe, the one where they'd first met. She ordered her usual, a latte with a dash of cinnamon, and opened the book again. This time she scrutinized every word, searching for patterns, hidden meanings, or clues. Caleb was a storyteller after all. His clues wouldn't be obvious. Hours passed, and her coffee grew cold. She was about to give up when something struck her. In the margins of certain pages, faint indentations marred the paper. She tilted the book toward the light, and her breath caught. It was Braille. Ellie's pulse quickened as she snapped a picture of the markings and searched online for a Braille alphabet chart. Translating the dots was slow work, but eventually she pieced together a message. Saturday, 6 p.m., the bridge where the stars meet the sea. Her heart leapt. The city's famous suspension bridge, with its glittering lights that mirrored the water below, was the only place Caleb could mean. The fact that he'd planned this so meticulously, leaving breadcrumbs for her to follow, sent a shiver of excitement through her. That evening, Ellie stood on the bridge, the wind tangling her curls and the scent of salt water filling the air. The city's skyline glowed in the distance, but her gaze was fixed on the path ahead. Every step felt heavier than the last as she walked toward the center of the bridge, where a figure leaned against the railing, silhouetted against the twilight. It was Caleb. He turned as she approached, his hazel eyes crinkling at the corners. "Took you long enough?" he said, his tone teasing but warm. Ellie laughed, a sound carried away by the breeze. "You're impossible, you know that? And you're predictable," he countered. "I knew you wouldn't give up." They stood there for a moment, the hum of traffic and the lapping of waves below filling the silence. Finally, Ellie crossed her arms. "So what's this all about? The cryptic notes? The treasure hunt? You could have just asked me for coffee, you know." Caleb grinned, but there was a seriousness in his gaze now. "I could have. But where's the fun in that? Life's too short for ordinary, Ellie. I wanted you to see the world the way I see it, as an endless series of stories waiting to be discovered." Ellie tilted her head, studying him. "And what's the story now?" He looked out over the water, his expression thoughtful. "That's the thing about stories. They're better when they're written together, but only if both people want the same ending." Her heart clenched at the vulnerability in his words. She had spent so much of her life planning, controlling, and striving for perfection that she'd forgotten how to let go and just feel. But here was Caleb, offering her something messy, uncertain, and beautifully real. "I don't know what the ending looks like," she admitted softly, "but I'm willing to find out." His smile deepened, and he held out his hand. That's all I needed to hear. As the weeks turned into months, Ellie and Caleb wrote their story together, one chapter at a time. Their days were filled with shared laughter, impromptu adventures, and quiet moments where words weren't needed. Ellie learned to loosen her grip on the rigid structure of her life, while Caleb discovered the joy of staying in one place long enough to plant roots. But life, as Caleb often reminded her, was unpredictable. One crisp autumn morning, Ellie woke to find a note on her pillow in Caleb's familiar scrawl. Ellie, sometimes, a story takes an unexpected turn. I've been offered a chance to report on something big, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I couldn't bring myself to wake you because I knew you'd try to stop me. But don't think of this as an ending. Think of it as an interlude. Yours, Caleb. Ellie sat there for a long time, the note trembling in her hands. Part of her wanted to be furious, but another part, a deeper, quieter part, understood. Caleb had always been a wanderer, chasing stories like fireflies in the dark. She folded the note carefully and placed it inside Ellie's rainy night. Then, with a deep breath, she began writing in the blank pages at the back of the book. Sometimes, love isn't about holding on. It's about letting go and trusting that somewhere, your paths will cross again. And with that, Ellie turned the page, ready to write the next chapter of her life. Chapter 3. When Paths Cross Again. 5 years had passed since Caleb had walked out of Ellie's life, leaving behind little more than a note and the echoes of what might have been. In those years, Ellie had built a life she was proud of, one that didn't depend on someone else to define it. She'd opened her own bookstore on a quiet street in New Haven, the kind of cozy place where strangers became friends over a shared love of stories. The shop, aptly named Chapters Unwritten, had become her sanctuary. Sunlight streamed through the large bay windows, illuminating shelves lined with books that carried the weight of countless lives and adventures. On the wall behind the counter hung the framed copy of Ellie's Rainy Night, a reminder of the night that had changed everything. Ellie had moved on, or so she told herself. She went on dates, traveled to places she once only dreamed of, and found joy in the simple routines of her life. But on rainy nights, when the streets glistened like rivers of ink, she still thought of Caleb. It was on one such night that he returned. The rain was falling in steady drizzles, the kind that whispered against the windows and lulled the world into quiet contemplation. Ellie was closing up shop, her hands deftly stacking books onto a cart, when the bell above the door chimed. "We're closed," she called out without turning, assuming it was one of her regulars trying to sneak in a last-minute visit. "Even for an old friend," came a familiar voice. Ellie froze, her hands gripping the edge of the cart. Slowly she turned, her breath catching at the sight of him. Caleb stood just inside the doorway, his dark hair damp from the rain and a worn leather duffel slung over one shoulder. He looked older, his features sharper, but the warmth in his hazel eyes was unchanged. "Caleb," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Hi, Ellie." He gave her that crooked smile that once had the power to unravel her carefully constructed walls. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the years folding into nothing. Then, as if pulled by some invisible force, Ellie crossed the room until they were standing mere inches apart. "You disappeared," she said, her tone edged with something between accusation and longing. "I did." Caleb's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "And I've regretted it every day since." Ellie crossed her arms, a shield against the emotions threatening to spill over. "Why now? Why come back after all this time?" Caleb set his bag down and ran a hand through his hair, his expression raw and unguarded. "Because every story I chased, every place I went, it always led me back to you. I thought leaving would help me find what I was looking for, but all I found was how much I'd lost." Ellie's heart twisted. She wanted to stay angry, to remind him of the hurt he'd caused, but the sincerity in his voice made it impossible. Instead, she asked, "Why didn't you write or call?" "I tried," Caleb admitted, his gaze falling to the floor. "Dozens of times. But every time I picked up a pen or dialed your number, I felt like I didn't have the right. Not after leaving the way I did." Ellie let out a soft, bitter laugh. "You always did have a flair for dramatics." Caleb looked up, a sheepish smile tugging at his lips. Guilty as charged. Silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken words. "I'm not the same person you left behind," Ellie finally said, her voice steady. "I wouldn't expect you to be," Caleb replied. "And I don't expect you to forgive me. I had to see you, to tell you that you've always been the story I wanted to write, even if I got it all wrong the first time." Ellie studied him, her emotions a tempest of longing, anger, and something dangerously close to hope. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Caleb. Not yet." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then let me earn it, however long it takes." Before she could respond, the rain outside intensified, the sound filling the space between them. Caleb glanced at the framed book behind the counter, his lips curving into a small, wistful smile. "You kept it," he said softly. "It's a good story," Ellie said, her tone neutral. "It's an unfinished one," Caleb replied, his eyes locking with hers. "But I'd like to change that, if you'll let me." Ellie's heart was a riot of emotions, but she forced herself to take a breath. "I'm not making any promises," she said. "Fair enough." Caleb picked up his bag, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Then how about a fresh start? Coffee tomorrow morning at the cafe where it all began." Ellie hesitated, her instinct to protect herself warring with the part of her that still believed in second chances. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, tomorrow." Caleb's smile was small but genuine. "Thank you, Ellie." As he left, the bell chimed again, and Ellie stood there for a long moment staring at the door. She didn't know what the next chapter would hold, but for the first time in years, she was willing to find out. The rain continued to fall, but this time it didn't feel lonely. It felt like a prelude. Chapter 4, Writing the Unwritten. The cafe was buzzing with morning energy, clinking cups, low laughter, and the hum of casual conversations. The air was thick with the aroma of freshly ground coffee, warm pastries, and something Ellie couldn't quite place. It felt different today, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She sat at a corner table by the window, nursing her latte and watching the street beyond. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement glistening under the weak winter sunlight. Ellie was early, of course. She always was. Caleb arrived 10 minutes later, the door swinging open with an easy confidence that Ellie both envied and resented. He spotted her immediately and made his way over, his leather jacket slightly frayed at the cuffs, and his smile cautious but genuine. "Morning," he said, setting his bag on the chair beside him. "Morning," Ellie replied, her voice steady despite the nervous fluttering in her chest. They ordered, the same as before. Caleb's tea arrived with its ghostly steam, and Ellie couldn't help but smile at the symmetry of it all. "So," Caleb began, leaning forward slightly, "where do we start?" Ellie arched an eyebrow. "You tell me. You're the one who left me with a cryptic book and years of unanswered questions." Caleb chuckled, though his eyes softened. "Fair point, but I think this time we should skip the riddles." Ellie leaned back, folding her arms. "Fine, start with the truth. Why did you leave, Caleb? Really?" He exhaled slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of his cup. "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of settling down, of losing the freedom I thought I needed to be who I was. And honestly, I was afraid I'd screw it up. You were so much more grounded than I was, Ellie. You had a plan, a purpose. I didn't want to be the one to throw you off track." Ellie's lips pressed into a thin line. "You didn't give me the chance to decide that for myself." "I know," he said quietly, "and I've regretted it every day since." The honesty in his voice tugged at something deep inside her, but Ellie wasn't ready to let go of her guard just yet. "So what changed?" "I did," Caleb said simply. "I've spent the last 5 years chasing stories, meeting incredible people, and seeing things I never thought I'd see. But every time I finished a piece, every time I found myself in some far-flung corner of the world, it still felt incomplete, like there was something missing." Ellie tilted her head, her expression skeptical. "And you think that something is me?" "I know it is," Caleb said, his hazel eyes steady on hers. "I don't want to be that guy who shows up out of the blue and expects everything to be the same. I want to be the guy who earns a place in your life again." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Ellie studied him, searching for cracks in his sincerity, but all she found was vulnerability and hope. "I don't know if I can trust you, Caleb," she said softly. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I get that, and I'm not asking for all your trust right now, just a chance to prove I'm not the same person I was." Ellie looked down at her latte, her thoughts swirling. Part of her wanted to protect herself, to say no and walk away. But another part, the part that still believed in the magic of rainy nights and shared stories, wanted to take the risk. "Okay," she said finally. "One step at a time. No promises, no guarantees." Caleb's smile was small but genuine, I wouldn't have it any other way. The next few weeks were a cautious dance. Caleb showed up every morning at Chapters Unwritten, sometimes helping her rearrange shelves, other times just keeping her company while she worked. He shared stories of his travels, hilarious, heartbreaking, and everything in between, and slowly Ellie found herself laughing with him again. One evening, as they closed up the shop together, Caleb hesitated at the door. "There's something I want to show you," he said. Ellie glanced at him, curious. "What is it? You'll see. Come on." He led her through the quiet streets, the night air crisp and filled with the distant hum of the city. They arrived at an old warehouse, its brick walls covered in murals and ivy. Inside, the space was transformed, a gallery filled with photographs from all over the world. "These are yours?" Ellie asked, her voice filled with awe. Caleb nodded, his expression modest. "It's a collection of the stories I've chased, but there's one more I want to add." He guided her to the center of the room, where an empty frame hung on the wall. Beneath it was a plaque that read, "The Story I Almost Lost." Ellie stared at the frame, her throat tightening. "Caleb, I don't want to just tell stories anymore," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I want to build one, with you." Ellie turned to him, her heart pounding. "You're asking for a lot." "I know," he said, his gaze steady. "But for you, I'll give everything I have." The weight of his words settled over her, and for the first time in years, Ellie felt the walls she'd built begin to crack. "Let's see where the story takes us," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb smiled, the kind of smile that made her believe in impossible things. To the next chapter, then. And as they stood there, surrounded by the stories of his past, Ellie realized they were finally ready to write the one that mattered most, their own. Chapter 5. The Story We Didn't See Coming. Ellie wasn't sure when their tentative truce had shifted into something more. Maybe it was the night they stayed late at Chapters Unwritten, drinking wine and reading passages from their favorite books. Or the rainy afternoon Caleb surprised her with her favorite cinnamon latte, grinning like a kid who'd solved a riddle. Whatever the moment, their story was unfolding again, a slow but deliberate turning of pages. It felt different this time. Not the heady rush of a whirlwind romance, but the steady, comforting rhythm of something real. But life, as Caleb had once told her, had a way of introducing twists when you least expected them. The gallery was a success. Caleb's exhibit, The Story I Almost Lost, had drawn crowds from all over the city. Critics praised his ability to weave emotion into every photograph, and visitors lingered in front of the empty frame at the center, intrigued by its mystery. Ellie found herself at the gallery more often than she'd planned, helping Caleb greet guests and answering questions about the stories behind the photos. She had to admit, watching him thrive in his element made her heart ache in a way she couldn't quite describe. One evening, as the final guests trickled out, Caleb approached her with a glimmer in his eyes. "Ellie, there's something I want to show you." She raised an eyebrow. "Another secret hiding in plain sight?" "Something like that," he said, taking her hand. He led her to the back of the gallery, where a small room was tucked away. Inside, the walls were bare except for a single photo mounted under soft, golden light. Ellie froze when she saw it. It was of her, standing in the rain outside her bookstore. The shot was candid, her face tilted upward, her curls damp, and her expression a mix of joy and wistfulness. "Caleb." Her voice caught in her throat. "I took it the day I came back," he said, his tone quiet. "I didn't know if you'd want to see me, so I stayed across the street. But you stood there in the rain like you didn't care about anything else, and I knew I couldn't let you slip away again." Ellie stepped closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame. "It's beautiful." "So are you," he said, his voice soft. Their eyes met, and for a moment the world faded away. Then Caleb's phone buzzed, shattering the moment. He glanced at the screen, and Ellie saw a flicker of something she couldn't place. Hesitation, maybe, or doubt. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said quickly, slipping the phone into his pocket. "Just a work thing." Ellie wanted to press him, but something in his tone held her back. A week later, Caleb was distracted. He still showed up at the bookstore, still teased her about her obsession with alphabetizing, but his mind seemed somewhere else. One evening, as they sat on her couch with takeout containers between them, Ellie decided she couldn't ignore it anymore. "Caleb, what's going on?" she asked. He looked up from his pad thai, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "You've been distant," she said, searching his face. "If something's wrong, you can tell me." He hesitated, the weight of whatever he was carrying visible in his eyes. Finally, he set his fork down. "Ellie, there's something I need to tell you." Her stomach tightened. "Okay." "I got an offer," he said. "A big one. There's a team of journalists heading to South America to document a major environmental crisis. They want me to go with them." Ellie's chest constricted. "When?" "In 2 weeks." The words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. "And you're going," she said, her voice flat. "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "I haven't decided yet." Ellie set her food aside, her appetite gone. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I didn't want to ruin this," he said, gesturing between them. "And because I'm scared, Ellie. Scared that if I go, I'll lose you again. But if I stay, I'll always wonder what I gave up." Ellie's throat tightened. She wanted to scream, to tell him he couldn't keep walking away when things got hard. But she also knew Caleb's restless spirit was part of who he was. "What do you want me to say, Caleb?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I don't know," he said softly. "Maybe that you understand, or that you'll wait for me." Ellie stood, pacing the room as she tried to process the storm of emotions inside her. "You want me to wait for you to figure out if I'm enough?" "No," Caleb said, standing too. "That's not what this is about. You are enough, Ellie. You always have been. But this is about more than us. It's about doing something that matters." Ellie stopped, her eyes brimming with tears. "So is this," she said, her voice trembling. "We matter. Caleb." "I know," he said, stepping closer. "And I don't want to lose you, but I don't want to lose myself either." The honesty in his words shattered something inside her. She loved him, but she couldn't ask him to stay. "You have to go," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Caleb's expression crumpled. "Ellie, go," she repeated, meeting his gaze. "And this time, don't come back unless you're sure, because I can't do this again." Caleb reached for her, his hand brushing her cheek. "I love you," he said, his voice raw. Ellie closed her eyes, letting the tears fall. "I love you too. That's why I have to let you go." 2 weeks later, Caleb boarded a plane. Ellie stood at the bookstore, staring at the empty frame on the wall. She didn't know if their story was over or if this was just another chapter. But for the first time, she realized she didn't need an answer. Her story wasn't just about Caleb. It was about her strength, her resilience, and her willingness to embrace the unknown. As she turned the sign to closed and stepped into the cool evening air, Ellie smiled. The rain began to fall, soft and steady, and she let it wash over her, knowing that whatever came next, she was ready. Final chapter, the epilogue we didn't expect. The seasons changed, and life moved forward as it always does. Ellie's bookstore flourished, becoming a haven for the community. She hosted poetry readings, book clubs, and even started a small writing workshop. Chapters Unwritten became more than a business. It was a home for stories, connections, and growth. But some days, when the rain fell or when a familiar song played on the radio, Ellie's thoughts drifted to Caleb. She'd heard nothing from him since he left, just as she'd asked. No letters, no calls, no photos from his travels. She wasn't sure if that silence was a relief or a wound. 2 years passed. On an unremarkable spring afternoon, Ellie found herself tidying the shelves, humming a tune under her breath. The doorbell jingled, and she turned, expecting a regular customer. Instead, a courier stood there, holding a package. "Delivery for Ellie Bennett," the courier said, handing her a box wrapped in brown paper. Ellie frowned, her name scrawled on the label in a familiar handwriting. Her heart skipped a beat as she thanked the courier and carried the package to the counter. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it. Inside was a stack of photographs, a letter, and a small, leather-bound notebook. The photos were breathtaking. Caleb had captured scenes from his time in South America, vast rainforests, communities rebuilding after devastation, and quiet, intimate portraits of people and places. But it was the last photo that made her pause. It was of a woman standing in a sunlit field, her back to the camera, her head tilted as if she were listening to the wind. She recognized the curve of her shoulders, the way her hair fell in loose waves. It was her. The caption on the back read, The story I never stopped writing. Her fingers brushed the edges of the photo before she picked up the letter. Dear Ellie, I've written this letter 100 times, but none of the words ever felt right. Maybe they never will. 2 years ago, I left because I thought I needed the world to fill the emptiness inside me. But the truth is, the world only made me see how much I already had, and how much I'd thrown away. Every story I chased, every photo I took, was about trying to make sense of something bigger than myself. But the story that mattered most was the one I had with you. You told me not to come back unless I was sure, so I've spent the last 2 years finding that certainty. And here it is. I love you, Ellie. I've always loved you. I'm back in New Haven. If you're willing, I'd like to meet. No expectations, no pressure, just coffee, like old times. If you don't want to see me, I'll understand. But if you do, I'll be waiting at the cafe tomorrow morning, the place where it all began. Yours, Caleb. Ellie read the letter twice, her heart pounding. She set it down, her emotions a whirlwind of hope, fear, and cautious optimism. She spent the evening pacing her apartment, staring at the letter, debating whether she could open herself up to him again. But as the night wore on, a quiet voice inside her began to speak. This was her story, too. The next morning, Ellie walked into the cafe. It looked the same as it always had. Bustling with energy, the smell of coffee and baked goods filling the air. She spotted him immediately, sitting at the same table they'd shared years ago, a steaming cup of tea in front of him. Caleb looked up as the doorbell chimed, his eyes locking with hers. He stood, uncertainty flickering across his face. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ellie smiled, a small tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. Caleb's face lit up, and he took a step toward her. Hi, he said, his voice soft and filled with everything he couldn't say. Hi, Ellie replied. She sat down, her heart still racing but steadying with each passing second. Caleb slid a cup of coffee across the table to her, her usual order. Still remember? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Always, he said with a grin. And as they began to talk, the rest of the cafe faded away. Their story wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it didn't need to be. This time, they weren't trying to rewrite the past or race toward a happy ending. They were simply turning the page, one chapter at a time.